All right, so welcome back. In this part, what we're going to look at now is how our muscles, along with a load or a resistance or a weight, along with a fulcrum, these three things together, so the muscle, a load or a weight, and a fulcrum, how these three things are going to contribute to something that we'll call a skeletal muscle lever. All right. So a lever, it's going to involve these three things. It's going to involve a muscle, right? The muscle is going to be applying the force, the muscle force, that will lead to the movement of this lever, all right? So to think of a lever, think of something like a door. There's a fulcrum. The fulcrum is the point at which this lever is going to pivot. Like, so if you think of a door, the door where it moves, where it pivots is at the hinge, right? If you think of something like a wheelbarrow, right? Where it pivots, where it hinges, where it moves is at the tire, right? Whenever you pick up on the handles and you tilt it forward, right? So you have the muscle, you have the fulcrum, and then you have the load, or what you could call the weight, or the resistance, right? Or the resistant force, okay? This is the thing that you're having to move against, all right? So we'll look at these levers. There are three different kinds, and the type of lever that we'll look at, they'll vary depending on what is in the middle. So sometimes the fulcrum is in the middle, sometimes the load is in the middle, or sometimes the muscle or the effort is in the middle, all right? So we will start here, and we'll look at our first one, which is a first class lever, right? So first class lever, in this case, the fulcrum, or the point at which this lever is pivoting, where it's hinging and moving, is in the middle. So between the load or the weight and the effort, which is represented by the muscle or the muscle tendon unit. All right. So a first class lever in our body is the um, uh, atlanto-occipital joint, right? So this is where the atlas, so the atlanto is referring to atlas, which is C1, our first cervical vertebrae, and the occipital bone, specifically the occipital condyles of the occipital bone, where these two articulate and join each other. This is a first class lever, right? Along with the muscle at the back of the head and the weight of the skull in front, right? So if you look at the animation in the top right, what you see are three things, right? You see this kind of schematic here with a load, a fulcrum, and the effort, and then you see it how it would be in the human. So you have a load, which is just the weight of the skull. You have the fulcrum, which is between the occipital condyles and atlas or C1, and then you have the effort, which is being supplied by some of the muscles of the neck and back muscles on the posterior side of the head, right? So what you have is the muscles they pull on the occipital bone, they pull the head backwards. You pivot at the fulcrum, right? And depending on how much weight here, how much the load is, you're going to have different amounts of force be produced by the muscle or by the effort in this case, right? So you can think of like a seesaw or a teeter-totter, right? One person on one side would be the load, one would be the effort. If you go up to a seesaw or a teeter-totter, whatever you want to call it, and there's somebody already sitting on one side, they're representing the load, right? So they are weighing it down on that one side. You going onto it, you're going to be the effort. You're the muscle in this case that's applying force, applying tension, and you're trying to move them, the other person. So in this case, you're trying to move the load by pivoting around the fulcrum, right? So the fulcrum would be that point in the middle where it's going to hinge down and hinge up and hinge down and hinge up and so on, okay? So you see the same thing here. So here's one area, the effort, the muscle. You see the fulcrum or the pivot point in the middle, and then the load over here, right? So you can work out muscles or cause muscles to hypertrophy and increase in size by increasing the load that they have to act against, right? So this is the whole basis of working out, of resistance training, of weight training, right? So if you ever put weights kind of hanging off the front of your head, and there are exercises that you could essentially think of as like neck raises, in which you're applying a weight over the front side of the skull. Kind of, it may be dangling down, it may be hanging down here, but it's adding to the weight of the load here. So that means that the muscles of the neck are having to produce more tension in order to pivot around the fulcrum to move the head back as a result of this increase in the load, right? So this is a first class lever. The fulcrum is in the middle. Second class, we have the resistance in the middle, or the weight in the middle, right? So an example of this is our ankle whenever we are plantar flexing, right? So whenever we go and we stand up on our toes, we go from being flat-footed and we push ourselves up onto our toes, we're utilizing a second-class lever, all right? These are not extremely common in the body, and in this case, the weight is in the middle. So if you look at our ankle example, down here on the left, the area where we push up onto our toes, that's where we're actually pivoting. That's the fulcrum, right? So in this animation to the right, this point here where we go up on our toes, that is the fulcrum. The muscle in the back, so our calf muscles here, that is the effort. That's the muscle force that is being applied onto the foot. And then in the middle between these two, you have the weight. And in this case, it's the weight of the body, right? We have all the weight from our upper body. We have the weight from our lower body, including our legs, coming down onto our foot. And it's being applied through the tibia and partly through the fibula, but mainly through the tibia, down onto the foot, right? Where you see that where the tibia meets the foot is in the middle between the effort, the muscle effort, and the fulcrum, right? So it's coming down right in the middle. So in this case, because it's in the middle, you have a second class lever, right? Just like you did with the first class lever, you can add weight, increase the amount of weight that would cause the effort, or in this case, the muscle force, to have to increase in order to still produce the movement, right? So this is the basis of things like calf raises, right? If you stand on kind of an elevated surface and you hold weights in your hands and you go up onto your toes, you notice that it is a little bit more difficult, and it's because you're adding weight. So you're adding to this region here, to this resistant force, that's causing the effort. So in this case, the calf muscles, maybe the gastrocnemius, the soleus, they're having to increase the amount of tension they produce in order to produce the same movement, right? So this is the basis of things like calf raises, right? And then lastly, you have your third class lever, right? This is a very common one in the body. So an example of this is like our knee whenever we are going into knee extension, or our elbow whenever we're doing elbow flexion, right? So the animation that you see on the right side of the page. So in this case, the effort is in the middle, right? Or the muscle force is in the middle, right? So if you take your elbow joint, for example, you have your fulcrum, right? Which is just your elbow joint. So the humeral-ulnar joint between the trochlea of the humerus and the trochlear notch of the ulna, that's your fulcrum. You have the weight, which is your hand or something that you're holding in your hand. So imagine you're holding like a 5-pound dumbbell in your hand. That's the weight or the load or the resistive force. And then you have the effort in the middle, right? So you have weight, you have fulcrum. But if you look here, the muscle that's producing the movement, it looks like it's not in between the fulcrum and the weight. It looks like it's actually kind of back here. It looks like the fulcrum's in the middle, right? Which would be a first class lever. So why is this example a third class and not a first class lever? Well, what it is, it's not necessarily the muscle itself, but it's where that muscle blends with a tendon and where that tendon attaches to the bone. And in this case, the biceps muscle attaches to the biceps tendon, and then the tendon attaches to the radius in between the fulcrum and the weight, right? So here you can see the attachment of the tendon between the fulcrum and the weight. Here you see the same thing. So here's the fulcrum at the elbow. Here is where the muscle attaches via its tendon, and then there's the load or the weight, right? So the effort here, in this case, the muscle force is being applied via the tendon in between the fulcrum and the load here, right? So it's not always the actual muscle, the position of the actual muscle, because sometimes that muscle may be kind of behind the fulcrum or something, not in the middle, but it's where the muscle attaches to the tendon, and then that tendon goes and attaches and blends with the bone, all right? Same thing for the knee, right? If you think about your knee during knee extension, right? So you have your quadriceps muscle group, right? You then have your knee joint, so the tibiofemoral joint between the tibia and the femur, and then you have the load, which would be anything kind of down on the lower leg associated with the foot, right? So if you had ankle weights on or something, right? And you go to extend the knee, well, the fulcrum seems like it's in the middle of the knee because the quadriceps muscle is very high in the thigh, right? It's high up in the leg. But if you follow the quadriceps muscle down, you'll feel a tendon called the quadriceps femoris tendon, and then you follow that down and you feel the patellar ligament, and that attaches to the tibia in between the actual knee joint, which is the fulcrum, and the ankle foot region, which would be the weight or the load, right? So same thing, it's not necessarily where the muscle is, it's where the muscle attaches to the bone via the tendon, okay, and where the tendon attaches, right? So there's a relatively easy mnemonic to learn that helps you understand these three classes of levers, what's in the middle, and then an example for each. And I did not come up with this, but it seems to stick in my mind pretty well, so maybe it'll help you. And it is based off rhyming, right? So it's 1, 2, 3, FLE, TAB, right? So 3 EB, those all kind of rhyme. So 1, 2, 3, FLE, TAB. So first one is class, 1, 2, 3, first, second, third class. The middle one is 1, 2, 3. I'm sorry, it's FLE, which is fulcrum, load, or effort. So which one is in the middle? Fulcrum, load, or effort. If it's first class, it's fulcrum, second class, it's load, third class, it's E. And then TAB is an example, right? So the T stands for triceps extension, right? If you're extending your triceps, this is an example of a first class lever. You could also think of your atlanto-occipital joint, right? The A is the ankle joint whenever we're doing plantar flexion. So you're going up and you're standing up on your tiptoes, right? And then B would be like a bicep curl that we just did, or maybe extending the knee during knee extension at the tibiofemoral joint. Okay, so you can really figure out any class of lever just by looking at the structures involved. So looking at where the muscle is, where the tendon is, where the joint is that's serving as the fulcrum, and then looking where the load would be or the weight, and looking at what's in the middle, right? Obviously, if it's fulcrum in the middle, it's first class. If it's the load or the weight in the middle, it's second class. And if it's the effort or the muscle tendon unit kind of together, that's a third class lever, okay? All right, so we will stop here and we'll pick up with our next part, talking about some characteristics of different types of muscle fibers.